welcome to the Astranti Guide to BA1. We're going to guide you through the whole of BA1, which will give you a great understanding of the fundamentals of business economics. However, today we're going to start nice and slowly and just look at Chapter 1. So today's presentation will focus on business organisations. In this presentation, we're going to look at micro and macroeconomics and get a really good understanding of what economics means and how it can be split up into two different types. Then we're going to look at what an organisation actually is, and we'll finish up by looking at the various different types of organisation. We'll start by looking at economics. Now, when you ask most people, what is economics? They tend to know that it's something to do with money or finance or something similar. And while all of these things are good answers, they haven't really got to the crux of what economics is. So let's start off by giving ourselves a formal definition of economics. Economics concerns the allocations of scarce resources. Scarce resources is anything that there's a finite amount of. So that could be people, or it could be money, or if you're a farmer, it could be seeds because you've got only a limited supply of seeds. Now, economics can be split into two categories, macroeconomics and microeconomics. We'll start by considering macroeconomics. Macroeconomics considers the decisions which impact the whole country's economy. So we're looking at the scarce resources on a really large scale. When we discuss macroeconomics, we're thinking about things such as unemployment levels, interest rates, exchange rates, and inflation. All these things impact the country's economy. So these are all under macroeconomics. We'll look at all of these things in more detail on later chapters. But let's think of an example for macroeconomics. One scarce resource in macroeconomics would be the government's budget. The government's budget is a limited amount of money they can spend on the country as a whole. The government might choose to allocate, or in this case we mean spend, their scarce resource on things such as schools, hospitals, or even prisons. But we know economics doesn't just focus on decisions which impact the whole country's economy. Microeconomics considers decisions which are at the level of the business. In a business, the scarce resource might be something like the profit. Now, the business could decide to allocate these scarce resources on things such as employing new members of staff, increasing the amount they're spending on their advertising, or purchasing new machinery to increase the level of production. So we can see that there are some clear differences between micro and macroeconomics. But it's important that you understand both of these terms, because in the whole of BA1, you will need to know about macro and microeconomic issues. So now we've got a good understanding of that, let's move on to consider what is an organisation. You might think, this is a really basic question, I know what an organisation is. Google, for example, is an organisation and a perfectly good example. However, even while thinking we know what an organisation is and being able to think of many examples, we need a more formal, tight definition of what an organisation actually is. Therefore, an organisation is a group of people that is organised and managed in a way that aims to follow a corporate goal or need. We can see that actually this definition means that there are many different types of organisation which are possible. So we know that something like Google, a business, is an organisation, but under this definition, so are things like charities or societies. Let's have a look at organisations in a little bit more detail. This is Fred. Now, if Fred decides to go into business all by himself as a painter and a decorator, he will be a sole trader. He's a sole trader because he performs every role in the business. And he's doing it alone or solely. As a sole trader, Fred will need to do everything himself. So that's everything from the actual painting and decorating himself, from all his admin, to making sure he's turning up at the right client's house on the right day, to things like marketing, to make sure he's got more customers to see next week after he's finished his current jobs. And he even needs to think about his financing and do all his accounting too. A sole trader is a valid, if very demanding, business setup. However, what if Fred takes on an assistant? Well, now he's an organisation. That's because there's now a group of people, even at only two there's still a group, that's organised and managed in a way that follows the corporate goal or need of the organisation, which in Fred's case is to decorate houses and make money. Now that Fred has an assistant, the roles are shared. Now that Fred's got an assistant who he's organised to do all of his marketing for him, he can focus on things like the actual job itself, painting and decorating, as well as his admin and his accounts. So from this, we know there are three key things that all organisations must have: goals, that corporate goal or need, structure, and systems and procedures. Now, all organisations have structure, which is how the organisation's people are organised. All organisations also have systems, which are the processes which ensure all things happen efficiently and consistently. So we said that all organisations have goals. These are things which are worked towards by all of the members of the organisation. An example of this might be profit. In most businesses, the main goal of the business is to make profit. However, to do this, all organisations also need structure. Now, these structures are put in place to ensure that individuals know their role and they know what they're supposed to be doing. For example, there might be an accounting team who will do all the accounting for the organisation. There might also be a marketing team who will make sure that the organisation is well marketed. And finally, one more example might be for human resources, to make sure that the staff who are coming in are of the right calibre. Let's move on to consider systems and procedures in an organisation. Systems and procedures are the standard steps showing how key activities are undertaken. For example, there will generally be systems and procedures for production. If you think of a factory, they'll have some very strict systems and procedures to make sure their product comes out exactly the same every time. Another example of systems and procedures might be the way that an invoice is paid. If we think back to Fred, every single time he charges his customer an invoice, he might do it in the same way to ensure that they're always paying him into the right account. So we know that all organisations must have goals, structure, and systems and procedures. But all these things also need to be managed. These things all need to be controlled and reviewed, and this is where the management role comes in. Finally then, there's two more factors about the whole organisation which are always true. An organisation exists independently from any one member. It's also worth mentioning at this point that larger organisations may need more formal structures. I'm sure you can understand why at Google they're going to need more formal structures around their management than Fred will need for his marketing assistant. So you might be thinking, with all these different things that an organisation requires, why does anyone bother? Well, the important thing about an organisation is that it involves a lot of sharing. An organisation means that there can be sharing of ideas, experience, knowledge, skills, and resources. Because of all this sharing, an organisation will achieve more efficiently than individuals working alone. So now we've got a really good understanding of what an organisation is, let's have a look at some different types of organisation. Now, organisations can be split into two types, those in the private sector and those in the public sector. Organisations in the private sector are generally owned by shareholders. They're responsible to the shareholders, and by that we mean owners, but we'll talk about shareholders in more detail in another presentation. And they may be run both for profit and not for profit, although on the whole, most private sector organisations are run for profit. However, in the public sector, the organisations are owned by the state. They are also responsible to the government, and they are generally not run for profit. Organisations in the public sector can be split into two categories: state-owned industries and government offices. An example of a state-owned industry might be something like the NHS in the UK, or the Peace Corps in the USA. By contrast, an example for a government office might be the Department for Education. So now we've got a good understanding of the difference between the public and private sector, let's have a look at the private sector in more detail. Now, we said that in the private sector, organisations may be run for profit or not for profit. So this is another two categories for the private sector. Let's start by considering not-for-profit organisations in more detail. Now, not-for-profit organisations do not have goals and objectives of focusing on profit maximisation. However, as an organisation, of course, they still have a corporate goal or need, so that might be something such as feeding the homeless. Despite the fact that not-for-profit organisations do not focus on profit maximisation, they still have a similar structure to profit-seeking companies. By this we mean that not-for-profit organisations also aim to operate efficiently and be cost-effective. Examples of not-for-profit organisations might be charities or trade unions. Charities in the private sector may also be referred to as NGOs. NGO stands for non-governmental organisation. Put simply, an NGO is a private sector organisation which is not for profit. As their goals aren't for profit, their goals might include things like ethical standards or service delivery. An example of an NGO would be something like Oxfam. They operate outside of the government and in the private sector. Oxfam has as its goal to help those living in poverty internationally. Let's move on and consider profit-seeking organisations. Now, profit-seeking organisations have as their primary objective to maximise returns for the owners or shareholders. Now, a profit-seeking organisation can be split into unincorporated organisations and incorporated organisations. Pay attention for this bit because it's quite important and it will come up all the way through your BA1 studies. Now, an unincorporated organisation is where the business owner and the business itself hold the same legal identity. For example, let's think back to Fred, our decorator. If he becomes self-employed as a decorator, he may decide not to incorporate and simply trade solely as Fred. This certainly keeps things simple, and it means that Fred doesn't have to worry about keeping his finances separate from those of the business. Easy peasy. However, Fred not incorporating means he will be held personally responsible for any debts the business activities incur. In other words, if Fred's business gets into debt, he is personally responsible for paying it all off. Therefore, unincorporated businesses are considered to have an unlimited liability for the business's debts. So if that's what an unincorporated organisation is, what is an incorporated organisation? Well, an incorporated organisation is where the business owners and the business itself hold separate legal identities. If Fred decides to incorporate his business and become Fred Decorators Incorporated, this means that he has a legal separate identity from that of his business. Now, incorporating a business may be a little more complicated for Fred to sort out, but it does mean that he won't be held personally responsible for any debts that his organisation does incur. For that reason, incorporated organisations are considered to have a limited liability for the debts. So now we've understood the difference between an unincorporated and an incorporated organisation, let's have a look at the two main types of unincorporated organisation. Remember, unincorporated organisations hold the same legal identity as their owner, and there is an unlimited liability for debts. So the two main types of organisation in this category are sole owner and partnerships. Sole owner, well, we've already come across that term once today when we were talking about Fred. A sole owner means there is only one sole owner of the business who is wholly liable for the debts. That means that if Fred trades solely as Fred and then he spends £100,000 on paint and gets into debt for it, Fred himself is wholly liable for the debts because they have the same legal identity. However, another type of organisation which is still unincorporated is a partnership. Now, a partnership means there's a collection of owners who are jointly liable for the debts. Let's say Fred works with his wife, Roberta. If Fred and Roberta both spend £100,000 on paint, they are jointly liable for the debt. So between them, they must ensure it gets paid. So now we've seen two examples of an unincorporated organisation. Let's have a look at some examples of incorporated organisations. Again, incorporated organisations can be split into two categories: a private limited company and a public limited company. We'll start by looking at a private limited company. Now, these companies often have the word limited at the end of them. So if you ever see a company name that's called Company A Limited, you already know that it must be a private limited company and also that it must be an incorporated organisation. So that means there's a separate legal identity of the owners and the organisation itself. Private limited companies are called private because shares cannot be issued to the public. Because shares are not being issued to the public, private limited companies do not have to report to such a large number of shareholders. However, they must still publish their financial accounts. This is one reason why some larger companies may choose to remain private. By choosing to stay private, larger companies don't have to report to the large number of shareholders. By choosing to stay private, private limited companies retain a high degree of control of the business direction because there aren't loads of shareholders who can also have their say in how the organisation is run. However, on the whole, private companies tend to be smaller companies, for example, market town retailers. And when they are large companies, they are companies who are looking to retain a high degree of control. For example, Walker's Snack Food Limited are an example of a private limited company who are a large company who have remained private, as is the Virgin Group Limited. Let's move on to looking at public limited companies. Now, public limited companies are companies which are often referred to as PLC. If you're ever getting confused and can't remember whether P in PLC stands for public or private, just think that the public P likes to be seen, whereas the private P, for private limited company, doesn't. That's why they're called limited instead. Now, in a public limited company, shares can be issued to the public and are traded on the stock market. So in the UK, shares are traded on the London Stock Exchange. The downside to being a public limited company is that the owners may risk losing control by selling stakes to the public. Owners must also report to a large number of shareholders and comply with additional regulations. There are many strict rules that PLCs must obey because they're being sold to the public. Because of these additional regulations and the fact that becoming a public limited company is so expensive, PLCs tend to be large companies who have issued shares to fund a new business venture. Well-known PLCs would include companies such as Tesco's PLC or British Airways PLC. So with that, we've looked at all the different types of organisations there are. Or have we? There's one more type of organisation I want to mention briefly, and this is cooperatives. Cooperatives are special because they are owned and controlled by the members rather than the shareholders. These members could be staff, such as with the John Lewis Partnership, or they could be customers, such as with the Cooperative Group. Both of these are examples in the UK. As well as remembering that cooperatives are owned and controlled by the members rather than shareholders, one of the most important things you need to know about a cooperative is that while the profits are important, the welfare of the members is also a key goal. Before we move on from cooperatives, we're just going to look at mutual organisations. Mutual organisations are similar to cooperatives in that they are owned and controlled by the members. However, in a mutual organisation, these members tend to be customers rather than the staff. Another key difference between a mutual organisation and a cooperative is that mutual organisations tend to focus on financial services rather than physical products. The example we gave before of the cooperative or co-op in the UK is an example in which one of the main products they sell is food. However, mutual organisations tend to always focus on financial services. An example of a mutual organisation might be the Mutual Building Society nationwide in the UK. The good things about a mutual organisation is that the members benefit from the services like savings accounts and mortgages, but also members also benefit from receiving any trading surplus. So now we've covered mutual organisations and cooperatives, we've covered the whole range of different types of organisation. And with that, we've come to the end of this chapter on business organisations. We've discussed what economics are, both micro and macroeconomics. We've discussed what an organisation is and looked at the factors that make up an organisation. And then we looked at all the different types of organisation, specifically focusing on the public and private sector, and then moving on to consider unincorporated and incorporated organisations, the differences, and finally finishing up by looking at private limited companies and public limited companies. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation on business organisations. Now do go ahead and check out some of our further videos on BA1. Good luck in all your studying!